Hello and welcome to the Stoicism question. My name is Donald Robertson, and today's guest is award winning historian and novelist Dr. Adrian Goldsworthy. He's the author of numerous books on ancient history, especially the Romans, and today we'll be discussing his latest one, ancient Greece, which came out in May, Athens and Sparta, the rivalry that shaped ancient Greece. Hello and welcome to the podcast.
Hello there. Thank you very much for having me.
How many books have you written? Can you remember off the top of your head? Quite a few.
Yeah, it's getting to be embarrassingly many. I think this is the 14th non-fiction, and I think I've got my 14th novel coming out in next year sometime. So, it makes me sound very much like a hack who's just churning things out. But I do write full time. So,
Yeah.
there has been time and effort put into these books. But no, it's like that, when you're young, you remember what age you were and this sort of thing, and what O-levels you got. And then as the years pass, you have to stop and think. And then when did that happen? Or, when was the last
I think it's
test
a good
series
sign.
against the West Indies or something?
I think it's a good thing. So the first question I have for you is, this is all just ancient history, right? Why would anyone care? Surely nothing like this could ever happen again today. So that's what a lot of people might think, right? But do you think that readers will notice any parallels between ancient Athenian politics and, say, just hypothetically, modern American history or modern European history?
They will, but different people will see different parallels depending on your viewpoint of today. And there's always a danger if you go expecting to find lessons in the past, you'll find those lessons confirmed because you're looking for that sort of thing. I mean, Thucydides, the Athenian who wrote a history of the Peloponnesian War around about 400-ish, he died before he finished it. He said that he was writing because events like this will happen again because human nature is such. And ultimately, yes, a culture will affect how people see things, their attitudes, what they accept, but there is a basic humanity that if you look at people in classical Greece or earlier or later, we have in common. Without that, history would make very little sense and we wouldn't be able to understand it. But people react much as we would react in a similar situation. Yes, there are certain differences. So you have that. You also have a lot of emphasis on disputes within Greek cities. Greek cities were so prone to arguing with each other, to stasis, as the Greeks called it, where you turn from argument to revolution and you very quickly start killing your neighbor to be in charge or because you disagree with them. How easy it is for somebody else that you've lived alongside is like you in many respects suddenly to seem completely beyond the pale because they have the temerity to disagree with you. And then even worse, if they actually win an election or achieve something, there is that human element that we see all too often where, over here in Britain, you still have the Brexit debate will crop up and people will start yelling at each other over family gatherings or sort of friendly. It's surprising how bitter it is. So that reminds us, yes, we're not killing each other and we're not going to that revolution. But no, there's a lot that's very similar. And you're seeing with Athens a democracy that is pushed very much to an extreme where the voters get to decide everything and it's instant. That's quite different to a modern democracy, but it also shows you how people can react and change their minds very quickly. So I think humanity is the same. So in that respect, Thucydides is right. The events might not repeat themselves exactly, but there's an awful lot that's very similar.
I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but I think one of the things that might stand out is the centrality of rhetoric and political oratory to the nascent democracy in ancient Athens and the role that those play in ancient Greece in general, and maybe even, political rhetoric today, but also maybe the internet. Like in some ways, we might see kind of echoes of the extent to which propaganda or rhetoric or fake news or whatever you want to call it, on the internet might be something that people wrestle with. And the role of rhetoric, certainly the ancient philosophers, or particularly Socrates, was very concerned with the dangers of rhetoric.
Well, yes, exactly. And there's that, you have the whole sort of sophistry idea that you can just make any case, any argument at the drop of a hat and then change your mind but it is interesting. I mean, it's going slightly beyond the period I cover in the book, but you look at the speeches of Demosthenes, this Athenian orator in the 4th century BC. And when he starts talking about the good old days and things that happened in the past, he is often wildly wrong about what he's saying, which is very much how many modern politicians will cite the past to prove their case, but they're talking complete nonsense. It doesn't fit, that's not what happened. And again, depending on which side of the argument, you're both flipping the past to make it fit whatever you want at the time. So it again, that human element, but it's, I suppose, particularly once people start having the vote, then persuading those people to do things becomes very vital. And there are lots of ways of doing that.
Yeah, can speeches start wars and get people killed? Plato makes that argument in the Gorgias. Like, he has the sophist say the sophist is the most powerful man in the world because he can instigate wars.
You also have the
executions.
Rather tart comment by Herodotus where early on, when the Iranian Greeks, these are people who live on the coast of modern-day Turkey, they're rebelling against the Persian Empire, or planning to, and they ask first the Spartans and then the Athenians for help. And the Spartans ask, well, how far does the king of Persia live from the coast? And they're told, oh, it's more than a month's journey. So that as soon as they hear that, we're not interested, too far away. He goes and convinces the Athenians this is going to be great and we'll have loads of loot. And Herodotus sort of comments how much easier it is to persuade 1,000 people than one, because they get excited, they act as a crowd rather than rationally. So, but again, you've got to be careful, because obviously the philosophers are living in a world that's been shaped by the Peloponnesian War and by this rise of Athens and the disaster, stupid decisions like the expedition to Sicily, and that whole sense of, again, it's striking. This seems very modern, when who should be the demos, who should be the people, who actually gets a vote, and have they got to be right-thinking people of a suitable education? That was something we heard very much in Britain in the Brexit debate, was that the wrong people have voted. These ignorant people have decided they may just happen to be a majority, therefore their vote doesn't count. Or here in Wales, where I live, they've given the last election we had, 16-year-olds got to vote. And they're talking about that in national elections as well. But they're not considered adults by law. They don't pay taxes in the same way. So it's this, who do you decide? Who actually gets to be the people who are in the democracy? And that's still hotly debated, with everybody tending to work out, well, what benefits me and my party the most? Therefore, I'm for that, rather than necessarily what's wise.
Yeah. So you kind of touched on something a little bit, I think, which leads into my next question, which maybe is a good way of framing everything else that we're about to discuss, which is, what are our sources like for this period? How biased are they, and what's missing from them?
It's a lot. I mean, this is when Greek history kicks off and we can start to study it in some detail. You go before you're about 500-ish BC and it gets very, very shaky quite quickly. You have Herodotus, who talks about the period. His main theme is the Persian War, the Persian invasions of Greece that the Greeks managed to defeat, the Athenians and Spartans playing a prominent role in this. And then he explains that. Now, he's a Greek from Asia Minor, so he's a Greek who's grown up as part of the Persian Empire, but very much proud of this sense that we, the Hellenes, this race that are superior to the barbarians for the rest of the world. But Herodotus tells you all sorts of stories. He tells you about oracles and dreams and things that you suspect even he doesn't really believe. He throws in. You then later on have the very rational Thucydides, who's an Athenian who has a position of authority. He's commanding a naval squadron early in the Peloponnesian War, gets defeated, loses an important colony, and then goes into exile. So rather sulkily writes this history about it all. So it's very clear he hates certain politicians. So you have the demagogues, particularly people like Cleon, that he just cannot stand, and he will never give a fair hearing to them. But he does, give the basics of the thing, but he always assumes they have an ulterior motive, a sordid one. So when Cleon, he's supposed to be backed into a corner when he promises he could win a victory within a month, and then Herodotus says, well, people decided to make him do this just because they thought he was bound to fail, or they thought he'd be a coward and all that. You get fairly malicious comments, and other people like Pericles he rather likes. So you have someone there who is clearly trying to be accurate, but does have their own agenda. It's interesting that Thucydides sometimes tells us there are things about early Athenian history that he couldn't find out. So even 100 years later, they didn't necessarily know. And there's a whole gap between the two. The decades between the Persian Wars and 431, when the really big war between Athens and Sparta kicks off, quite major events we can't place in time too firmly. We sort of know roughly within a few years. We don't know a lot of details. So there are problems because of the focus, but they're still, by the standards of ancient history, these are pretty good sources. But then you come to, the Athenians are always talking about themselves. Athens is the place where the philosophical schools will get established, but where you've got drama, you've got comedy, you've got lampoons of famous politicians. They talk, the Spartans don't. We have two Spartan poets surviving in fragments. They don't tell us very much. Otherwise, the Spartans don't tell their story directly.
Yeah.
And a lot of the things we're told about Spartan society and what they did, it's always by outsiders. Occasionally it's by a Xenophon or someone who's a reasonable contemporary, lived in Sparta for a while, but often it's Plutarch writing 500 years later under the Roman Empire, who's a Greek, but he's also a Roman citizen. And they idealize Sparta. It's become this very sort of, paragon of virtue in certain respects, but doomed in other respects, but very simplistic. And the danger is, because we only have these little fragments, that scholars assume they're all accurate to start off with. They're all part of the same jigsaw.
Yeah.
And maybe Spartan society was a lot less static than some of the modern interpretations would suggest.
Well, that leads into the next question, which I thought, when I was trying to formulate this, maybe this sounds a bit contrived, but maybe it works. I wanted to ask you, how Athenian were the Spartans and how Spartan were the Athenians? To what extent are they? To some extent, they seem like complete opposites, and they are. But there's also some kind of overlap between them.
There is. I mean, they're all Greeks. They speak the same language, different dialect, but they all revere Homer. They revere the same stories, the same gods and goddesses. They want to excel at the Olympic Games, at the other big festivals you have as part of that cycle. That's one of the odd things, is that the sources will tell us about the Spartans doing something strange. They don't tell us when they did something that's probably just like all the other Greeks do. So we can tell most Spartans are literate and quite well educated, but there's nothing in any of the accounts that says how that happens. All the stuff about Spartan education is purely physical, about developing these military virtues, endurance, courage, all these sorts of things. So there's a lot actually that's quite common in the Greek world, and they're also both trying to excel, trying to be the best, trying to be top. The honor system they're following is similar. The Spartans are a little old-fashioned, and they have a different perception of themselves. They see themselves as the descendants of conquerors, and that the majority of the population, the sort of serf class, the helots, work for their benefit because their ancestors were defeated by us. Therefore, they deserve to be always in sort of bondage, effectively. Whereas the Athenians say, we're sprung from the soil of Attica, we've always been here, we're special because we're Athenian, and this is our country. So there's aspects of it. Spartan society is smaller. The true Spartans are the sort of narrow top of a very wide pyramid. There are lots more Athenians, and as the 5th century goes on, every Athenian citizen gets more and more role in public life. But what they're trying to do is actually quite similar. They're trying to be good citizens. I mean, Pericles, or Thucydides gives Pericles, the Athenian statesman, this great speech early on in the war about how our bravery as Athenians is better because we don't have to undergo all this harsh training. We're naturally brave, and we're doing it out of sound patriotic reasons rather than because we've been just hardened and brutalized almost in our lifestyle. But we can fight just as well as them, which they sort of can, but they still don't want to face the Spartans in battle. So there's an element where, and one of the things, I mean, there is clearly, and you see it with a lot of the philosophers, this sense that it's rather like having a lot of, back in my day at Oxford, there were quite a lot of Marxist scholars in various departments who were happily living there and eating big dinners at high table, didn't want to go and move to Moscow. But they admired a different system as purer, fairer, for the working for the benefit of all of society. They just didn't want to live in it. They wanted to. So a lot of Athenians see Sparta in that way, and they idealize it. Xenophon in particular, but others do as well.
Yeah. And does some of the Athenians maybe also have familial or political links to Sparta? And we'll come to this later, but some of them maybe switch sides.
Good old Alcibiades.
Yeah. Maybe there are other Athenian oligarchs that had kind of connections to Sparta.
Well, more generally, I mean, we only hear about these things occasionally, but the sort of Homeric tradition of your guest friendships, that if you're an aristocrat, you travel a lot. You sometimes do it as your almost a sort of informal ambassador, an envoy of your city, but you also do it for trade. You also do it to improve this sort of networking. And because you're part of the wealthy everywhere have the money to train in athletic sports, but also particularly, one of the really big prestigious things at the Olympics is the chariot race. You can only go in for that if you're rich. It needs horses, it needs space, it needs time to prepare all of this. The Spartans do very well for quite a long time in this. But again, they need the approval. They need to be admired by Athenians, by Thebans, by others who've been not quite as good, but are doing the same sort of thing. So it is part of this network. And we just occasionally hear of someone who has familial connections. It's not just Athens and Sparta, though obviously that's a prestigious thing. It's people elsewhere. And of course you have Cimon, the son of Miltiades earlier on, who is, names one of his sons, the Spartan, as it translates, and who, when the Spartans face a rebellion by the Helot population after a series of earthquakes that devastates the area, and immediately the serfs try and make a bid for freedom. The way Plutarch tells us is that Cimon sort of goes on his own first to help them with some of his family, his extended sort of people from his estates, and later on persuades the Athenians to send an army there, which he leads. And then the Spartans send them home and rather humiliate them. Having asked for them to come, something goes wrong, and we don't really know what. So there is clearly a lot of admiration, and aspects of how the Spartans behave epitomize the ideal for a Greek aristocrat. In terms of your conduct. So that's something that everybody, particularly, it's particularly the aristocracy, but quite a lot of the broader population rather aspires to that as well. So, has a sense that that's living the good life, that's proving your worth, whether it's your courage, your oratorical skills, your good luck. Even this emphasis on the Spartan laconic speech, this idea that they keep it clipped and short, but it is very carefully constructed to make a point. It's almost a style of oratory in its own way, just a sort of pared down to the basics. The famous one of when they're warned before Thermopylae, the Persians will shoot so many arrows, they'll cover the sun, and then it's good, we'll fight in the shade. It's this sort of, you're making a point. It's not just throwaway lines. It's something they cultivate.
Cicero said that Cato the Younger sounded like a Spartan, like he spoke like one. So some Romans maybe emulated this kind of loosely.
Very much so. I mean, it's again, and Cicero will be trying to, apart from obviously aping Demosthenes, but also when he quotes Homer, even from the point of view of making major political decisions, this is how I should behave. It would be dishonorable to do otherwise. You are going back to this past. So the Romans have this strong, big inferiority complex towards the greatness, to the point where he warns his brother, who's going off to be proconsul in Achaia, that the Athenians of today are not the Athenians we admire. They've degenerated. They're just a sort of but otherwise, because there is clearly this temptation to go there and just be wowed by these people with a far older culture that you're trying to copy. All good orators at Rome go to study in the Greek East, and they have to be fluent in Greek, to the point even where the Senate at one point bans Latin teaching of oratory altogether to keep the riffraff down, basically to stop people without enough money to do this, learning how to persuade a crowd.
Interesting. When did that happen?
That's late. It's either late 2nd or early 1st century BC. The census do it, encourage it at one point. I'd have to. That's an off the top of my head. So round about that period, but it's.
Well, I've got another basic background question. How did this happen? How did Athens and Sparta, and as you've mentioned, there are many other city-states in ancient Greece, how did Athens and Sparta become these kind of rival superpowers? And what set the stage for the Peloponnesian War?
It's odd, because the paradox is that their sort of finest hour, their great moment, is allying with each other to face the Persians. And the Spartans arrive too late for the Battle of Marathon, which the Athenians win with the help only of little Plataea, which is nearby. But again, these little cities, there are a lot of them. There's nearly 1,000 Greek city-states by the 4th century. And there's no inclination at all, even though everyone accepts we're all Greeks, they don't want to make a Greece. They don't want to make one country. There's no urge towards unification. It's all about as your city saying we are the best city around, and as an individual, I am the best person, both within my city and more generally. This desire to excel, for which you need an audience all the time to tell you that, and accept the fact you are better than they are. And but they fight together. Then in a bigger way, they fight the second Persian invasion under Xerxes. Between the two wars, there's 10 years between them. The Athenians, they have this big strike in this communally owned silver mines, and they use the money to build the biggest fleet in the Greek world.
Right.
They build 200 of these triremes, which is a state-of-the-art oared warship of the period. Incredibly expensive.
Yes.
And they just decide to do this. When they fight at Salamis with all the Greeks together, maybe at most there are 350 ships altogether, 200 of them Athenian. So no one else has anything like this. Yes. And that makes them matter militarily, which then causes issues for the Spartans.
Yes, big issues. So what can we learn about the strengths and weaknesses of democracy from the Athenians? That's the obvious analogy, I guess, from a modern perspective.
I mean, it's interesting, again, this would not be the first thing that a modern commentator would say, but Herodotus, when he talks about the Athenians becoming true democracy, is that before this time they didn't fight very well. Once they become a democracy, they are much more effective at waging war.
Interesting.
In the same way that similar things he says about the Spartans, that once they achieved internal stability and they weren't vying with each other and becoming violent, then they became superb at warfare. So they see this first as almost the sort of the prime function of a state is to fight. With the Athenians, you have a mixture, because on the one hand, it clearly motivates them to a great extent. And being an Athenian becomes something so special. I mean, they are very, very jealous of citizenship. All Greek states are. But whereas the Romans will free a slave and that slave becomes a citizen, and his children become full citizens with no restrictions at all on their rights. The Greeks just don't do this. You can move to Athens, you can live there, you can get the right to work there, but the chances of becoming an Athenian are almost nil, no matter how long your family stays there.
This is still true today. It's easy to get residence in Greece today, but it's quite difficult to get Greek citizenship. Bit of trivia.
Yeah, it is, but it again becomes that, what's the distinction? What matters so much to you? And the privileges you get, but also the obligations. I mean, on the one hand, you can see the Athenians meet, if you can be bothered to go, because not everybody, some people have to work, but every Athenian who turns up there at an assembly, his vote counts exactly the same as everyone else's. Now, it's always his vote. If you're a woman, forget it. You've got no political rights, as well as slaves, foreigners, this sort of thing. But there are probably 40 to 50,000 Athenian citizens by the sort of time, the start of the Peloponnesian War. That's men, all of whom can vote. And they can vote on anything. And if they can persuade the people presiding over the assembly to call on them, they can not only voice their opinion, but a vote can be taken on that. And there are no institutions. There isn't a sort of second house, like the Houses of Parliament here or Senate and Congress in the States. Once the people have decided, that decision is enforced as immediately as possible. There are no courts that are permanent. There are no institutions that delay this. So you have some decisions that are reversed overnight. The classic one being when the city of Mytilene on the island of Lesbos rebels against they've been an ally, they've joined the Spartans in the war, they rebel. The Athenian citizens assemble and first vote to execute all the men and sell the women and children in slavery. And then overnight, they start to think, maybe this is pushing things a little bit. They have another debate. The assembly summoned the next day. The debates, the arguments as presented are entirely pragmatic. It's not, is this right or wrong? It's, if we kill everybody, then the next group to rebel against us will think they've got nothing to lose by fighting to the last. Whereas if they know they've got a chance of survival, they might well quit early. And even though they were never going to win, the Athenians have had to send a big fleet to deal with this, and it's been very costly, it's been dangerous. So they eventually decide just to execute the ringleaders, confiscate some territory and land, but everyone else, they have reduced privileges, but nevertheless, they don't kill them. But again, they have to have a debate, and other people are saying, well, no one will respect us if they don't fear us. So you have these, and you have later on Pericles, the statesman who's the leader when they start the Peloponnesian War, says, one thing we can't do is get distracted. We've got to focus on Sparta, not go off.
Yeah.
After he's died, when there's a lull in the fighting, they suddenly develop this passion, Thucydides describes it as, for invading Sicily.
Yeah.
And as one of the people who's sort of, involved starts trying to do something again that can happen in modern politics, this chap called Nicaeus, who ends up commanding it, doesn't believe it's a good idea. So he starts exaggerating the difficulties of it.
Yeah.
Which just means they vote more resources to send more ships, more people, and more money. So the commitment gets bigger and bigger. So when it does go belly up, it's much, much worse.
Yeah. It's an epic example of shooting himself in the foot. Yeah. It's also quite a sort of puzzling thing in some ways, but also understandable from a kind of human point of view in another. It's odd.
It's also, there's a sense, the Athenians, they do have a very high opinion of themselves. And monuments like the Parthenon, we tend to celebrate it all with this beautiful example of Greek culture. This is the Athenians saying, we are great and we are better than everybody else. We're definitely better than the barbarians. Everyone knows that, but we're better than other Greeks.
Yeah,
it's a big sort of, raised finger to essentially everyone else, which you can't ignore. Yeah. I think they come to believe that they can do anything because they succeed so often that it gets a little bit intoxicating. There's that sense that, other people might not be able to do that, but we can. Doesn't matter what the dangers are.
To ask you about this, I get, for want of a better word, this kind of narcissism of certain ancient civilizations, the Athenians in particular. Now, this is kind of a stab in I feel this isn't entirely true, but I'm just curious to what extent it might have to do with the fact that it's a slave-owning society.
It's partly that, though. I mean, the thing is, other Greeks can end up as slaves if you capture them. They've never had any
reluctance
but then you want to do that.
But then wouldn't there be a motive for the Athenians to say, that's why we are special and inherently superior to barbarians and other Greeks? Because some of our slaves are foreigners and other Greeks.
I mean, I think we're
better than them.
There is that sense. It's this whole idea of inherent worth, of aristeia, this, from which we get the roots like aristocrat, this idea that you are showing your quality. And it goes back, it's there in the Iliad, it's there in the Odyssey, the sense that the heroes lead because they're just better than us. All the heroes, they're better looking, as well as braver and more skillful. And they take the risks. And you have debates about, we eat the best because we take these risks, and the sort of the whole Achilles question of, could I just have a quiet life and live to a ripe old age, or do I die young but famous? And what do you choose? So there's that emphasis. It's a little bit reinforcing, because then if you do succeed, if you've got this belief that success is deserved because of your inherent quality, then the more success that you have, the more you believe yourself to be, that just proves to me as well as everyone else that I am better.
Yeah. Just as a side note, I think one of the reasons that Socrates I think Socrates' execution was overdetermined. There were multiple reasons why he kind of had it coming, as it were. But I think one of the reasons may be the idea that virtue could be taught, including to slaves, foreigners, and, shock horror, women. It's potentially pretty subversive in Athenian society.
It is, because the aristocracy is still there. They're operating within a democratic framework. They know they've got to persuade people, but they've also got loads of money. And so if they want to show off, they can advertise themselves, they can give gifts to people, they can put people in their debt. You have it's Plutarch, and it's a rather sort of barbed comment, but the young Pericles is supposed to have been worried. He's competing with Cimon, who's got big estates, loads of money, showing off. And the advice he's given is, use the people's own money to give them things. So basically spend state money on giving things that then the citizens think are free, rather than part of the coming from their tax money, basically. So,
geez, that would never happen.
Exactly. You couldn't imagine it, could it, now these days? So
I was going to ask you then, I suppose we should mention briefly, so, ancient history tends to focus on the elites and men to a large extent. What will the status of slaves and women and this is where it gets interesting, Athens versus Sparta? Like, what were the differences? What were the status in general?
Well, starting with Sparta, because it's different and it's, in a sense, simpler. There are some ordinary slaves at Sparta, but the vast majority of people who do are the helots, that are these descendants of the conquered people, who are almost slaves, but not quite. And they are, there's the later tradition that every year the Spartan magistrates declare war on them to make it legal if you have to kill one during the course of a year. They have virtually no sense of or opportunity to progress beyond where they are. They are treated like dirt. They are publicly humiliated. On the other hand, occasionally they get recruited as soldiers, but there are stories that sometimes this is just a trick and that it's to lure the bravest away so you can then murder them, so they can't rebel. So Sparta's peculiar, but it is a deeply unfair society. It's an extreme form of apartheid almost.
But in the movies... I'm sure in 300 the guy, like the Leonidas, doesn't he shout something about freedom and all this kind of stuff? And is that a weird mashup of American jingoism and ancient Spartan propaganda? Like, Spartan was a totalitarian state, basically.
Well, the thing is, they would see it that the Spartans themselves, the peers as they call themselves, the equals, they are very free.
They're free.
And they're the only people, it's again this aristocratic view, we deserve this because we're better than you.
Yeah.
And you don't deserve this because this is your nature. And it comes back to this deeply entrenched idea that'll go well into the Roman period, that there is such thing as a slavish nature. That you are essentially deserve that, you are trapped in that, you cannot ever be. And if you have the temerity to become an imperial freedman or something like that, you are despised by the aristocracy.
This is sometimes attributed to Aristotle.
Yes, but it's just there. It's
part of the culture. He validated a cultural
exactly. I
assumption.
think something that it's, and of course, it's a comfortable thing to assume if you're one of the ones on top. It makes your life easier. You don't have to treat individuals with respect. Otherwise, you can just see them as objects, as simply, inherently inferior. So the Spartans have this very, very unbalanced society where the small elite gets lots of privilege. Athens is different. You don't have that, but you do have far more slaves in Athens.
Right.
They can't really get their freedom. On the other hand, early on, one of the lawgivers has made it illegal to attack and kill another citizen because, or at least kill a slave, because a poor citizen might look like a slave. So therefore you can't, you don't have that mistake. They work alongside free men and women. So you see them in inscriptions when you're building something like the Parthenon. A lot of the labor force is slave. Some will serve rowing in the galleys. In most cases, they'll get freedom for that. Some of them are given freedom for being willing to join the Athenians fighting at the Battle of Marathon. We don't know quite how many, and we don't know how much choice did the slave have? Did his master tell him you've got to do this? Or more likely, but there are disputes afterwards when they're desperate later on in the Peloponnesian War, and they free quite a lot of slaves to serve in the fleet.
Right.
So you have an odd mixture. Many of the aspects of living in Athens you can actually enjoy as a slave, but you're still a slave. You are still property. Your chances of freedom are slim, but you are not treated as badly as a Spartan helot most of the time. But it is still... very much there is this clear division between slave and free, and it is it's rarely crossed. If you do get freedom, you're not going to get citizenship,
right?
So you become a sort of resident mimetic equivalent, resident foreigner.
I think another paradox about this, and this, I assume this is like fairly, we're talking about kind of exceptions here rather than the rule, but you could, like, slaves could be highly educated, come from wealthy, prestigious families. Under certain circumstances, they might be more educated than their owners, in some cases more literate than their owners. If they were captured in warfare from another city, for example. Fido was a slave after the Platonic dialogue. He went on to become a famous philosopher. There's a story that Plato was captured and enslaved at one point. So anyone could potentially be enslaved.
Well, that's the thing. If you lose, and you can see it in drama. You can see it, this sense that war is terrible. And the Spartan poet Tyrtaeus talks about the fate of the conquered, that they've either become exile and they're trailing along with their sort of mother and their father, their elderly parents and their family with no home, or they're working the land and then giving half of all they produce to their masters. And then when that master, who's their brutal overlord, dies, they've got to pretend to mourn him at his funeral in a public display. So the Greeks have a very strong sense that war is terrible, but it focuses very much on the consequences of losing. Right. It's not that the thing itself is so inherently bad. They almost accept that as it's probably going to happen. At least it's likely. But what you don't want to do is lose. And there is some restraint. I mean, there is some surprise when the Spartans win the Peloponnesian War that they don't destroy Athens, they don't enslave the Athenians, because they sort of, other people are giving the impression, well, if the Athenians had won, that's probably what they would do. But there is also a sense that in the same way that somebody who becomes a slave through war isn't quite seen the same as someone who's born a slave. If you've been someone of more worth, more importance, you don't entirely lose that. But there is also this idea that there are some people you don't enslave. And it's partly, I mean, you tend to kill them instead. So, there are these mass executions of prisoners because you're not. But it's a sense of that would not enhance my reputation if I humiliate someone in that way by making them a slave. It's they're a member of the club, so I'll just kill them.
Right. And what about women? And, I mean, is it possible that in some respects women in Athenian society might be worse off than slaves? Or, how free were women in classical Athens or Sparta?
It always depends who you are. In Athens, a lot of women work if you're less well off, and they're quite an important part of the economy. So the aristocratic women, I mean, you have this sort of Pericles again in the funeral speech talks about, he's talking about war widows in this case, but more generally, there's this sense that if you're well off, you should not be talked about. Being talked about is a sign that it's gossip and you're too brazen, you're too forward. I mean, he has his long-term mistress, Aspasia, who she is far more prominent. We know more about her than we do about the wife he'd had earlier.
Controversial.
Very much so. But nevertheless, we know, and it's often hostile. There is the perception she's presented as educated, intelligent, politically savvy.
That's part of what makes her controversial.
Exactly, that's the thing. A decent woman, a proper wife, doesn't do that. We just don't talk about them. Paradoxically, though, it's Sparta where women have more freedom. Again, if you're one of the Spartans. So you do have a story about, or several stories about Gorgo, the wife of Leonidas, the man who gets killed at Thermopylae, who's the daughter of another Spartan king. She's the one who's tells her father, make sure, don't be associated with this man. He's trying to bribe you when the fellow from the Ionian cities is coming. On another occasion, supposedly, an exiled Spartan, a relative, sends blank letters to them. And she's the one who works out, well, there must be a secret. We've got to be able to treat this so we can read the secret hidden message. But the big thing is at Sparta is that Spartan women can own property in a way, in their own right. And they have considerable freedom. It's one of the reasons why there's a long-term problem in Sparta that most land ends up being concentrated in the hands of a relatively few families because they marry very carefully. But it's the only other Spartan poet we know after Titius is a man who writes verses to be sung by choruses of girls and young women. And alongside the formal male education, there's also a female education. Spartan women, and you get this in Athenian comedy as well, they're presented as better looking, more athletic, far more free in their opinions and their behavior. So it's an odd thing. Again, it's if you are an elite who dominates the sort of mass of the population, then you can afford to treat people, you can give more freedom to others. So it's a price really, or it comes through the price of the subjection of the Helots. But Spartan women are a lot freer, a lot more independent than Athenians are.
What can we learn? I'm curious about this question. I think in a way it sums up the whole thing. What can we learn about how alliances work from the Peloponnesian War?
There's some striking ones where you get these dramatic examples when the Athenians are organizing this alliance after the Persian War, but to keep pushing the Persians back, where you drop lead ingots into the sea. And the implication is this agreement will last until these float up to the surface. In one case, another example, they're even heated. So so you make all these solemn promises.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, people don't seem that reluctant to break them when they seal, partly because there is such a strong perception of honor, and I have to be treated in a way that fits with my sense of my own worth or my city's worth. And if ever you violate that, or we can convince ourselves or say that you've violated this, then we can break any treaty. So there is, I mean, it's interesting, the treaty that the Spartans inspire and preside over before the Second Persian invasion is supposed to end all warfare between the allies. So Aegina, this island that the Athenians have fought against many times, becomes part of it, and they have to stop. Once the war is over, this will resume. But there is this sense, the Spartans even argue when, after the Persians have been repulsed and they've sacked Athens, they've burned the Acropolis, they've pulled down part of the city walls of Athens, the Athenians want to build their walls again, and the Spartans tell them not to because they shouldn't need to, because we're all allies. Instead, the Athenians, through the wily Themistocles, trick them and sort of delay them, keep them busy until the walls are finished. So it's then. So you get these ideas that there could be something bigger and more longer lasting, but it doesn't really happen. There's so much individuality within aristocrats within a city, but then within the cities, this sense of it's almost as if at every moment you're assessing what's the pecking order. Where do I fit?
Yeah.
And you're very jealous of your status. You certainly don't want to drop down even a sort of step or two, a rung or two. And if you can, you'd like to go up. But everyone is very, very careful all the time about where they are, which makes it quite hard for permanent alliances, so that you often find cities that fight against former allies. And after the Peloponnesian War, when the Spartans win, they are very quickly, the Corinthians, the Thebans, who've been major allies of theirs, loyal all the way through when Athens was perceived as the greater danger, flip quickly and will side with each other, and sometimes with Athens as well, against Sparta. Because now Sparta is dominant, Sparta is swaggering around, Sparta is the big threat. So it's always this sense of, if somebody becomes too powerful, that starts to degrade my status and makes me think, well, I've got to do something about this. So you can change very quickly.
Now, looking at it from a very different perspective, I wanted to ask you, because I think you might be a good person to ask about this, what role do you think ancient technological advantages played in the outcome of the Peloponnesian War, or the history of that period? Military technology, for example.
The biggest one is the warship, the trireme. This is fairly new. It seems to appear in the 6th century, and it's really expensive to build in the first place. It's technically quite demanding, but for it to be any good at all, not only have you got to maintain it, which is also expensive, but you've got to go and practice. You've got to go out to sea, and you've got to sail. You've got to row. So it means that one of the things that distinguishes the Athenians after the Persian War is that even in years when they're not actually fighting anyone, they will still send a squadron of 60 or more ships to sea. So they end up building this pool of experienced rowers, helmsmen, captains, and it's knowledge that is learned by experience and passed on to some extent by people with advice, but you can't get it quickly. And
the churn rate during the Peloponnesian War seems to be pretty high. They keep losing a lot of these ships and then building them, I think, surprisingly quickly sometimes, and then having to crew them with different people that maybe haven't got the skills that they need.
Well, that's near the end, because what happens early on, the Spartans haven't got a fleet. They rely on their allies, but they don't have the numbers to face the Athenians. So the scary thing is that, having celebrated how marvelous it was when we stood side by side, David against Goliath, we defeated the Persians. At the start of the war, the Spartans send envoys to Persia saying, could you give us some money to help us fight the Athenians? And the Athenians are asking the same in reverse. They don't get it for ages. When they do get it, the Spartans build a fleet, but other than the commander or a couple of senior officers, there are no Spartans involved. You're not going to risk Spartans as rowers. So it's of allies, it's of mercenaries, hired people. You can't quickly match the Athenian skill that's built up. This is like the Royal Navy in Nelson's time. It's got really, really good because it's practicing all the time. And no matter how many ships the French or Spanish build, you can't catch up with that quickly. And it's very hard to deal with that sort of expectation of victory. that's developed in the other side, as alongside the skill. They just believe more, and they tend to win. So it takes a while before the Athenians start to, but then they lose a load of ships when they go off on the Sicilian expedition. It all goes badly wrong at Syracuse. Later on, they start to make some odd decisions about commanders. But it's not really until the very end, when Athens is exhausted, and it's Persian money that allows the Spartans to keep on replacing the ships they lose.
Yeah.
But in the end, Athens just doesn't have, it's from the beginning when Pericles had said, we've got to just fight this war at sea, we won't meet the Spartans on land, we've got all this reserve of silver money in our treasuries. It's still only for a few years of war. They weren't really planning for what it turned into. And the expense is constant.
I was going to ask you about that. So here's a what if scenario, like an obvious one. What would have happened if the Athenians had stuck to the military policies of Pericles?
The problem with them is that this is a way not to lose a war.
Yeah.
So it relies on the Spartans giving up in the end and negotiating and accepting that Athens is now their equal.
Not fighting them.
Yes,
it was basically policy.
Yeah, we don't fight the Spartans on land, stay inside the city, we can feed the city by sea, we'll bring food in. Now this, of course, makes the epidemic of the plague that appears far, far worse, because you've crowded the city out. But they survive that. That doesn't bring them down. They go on fighting for a very long period afterwards. So in spite of these appalling losses, Athenian democracy is remarkably resilient. But they don't actually have a plan for how will we convince the Spartans that they've lost. Because Sparta's big strength is its army. Now that's based on the Helots, the serfs. Now they do establish this little base at Pylos on the coast of Spartan territory, where they accept runaway Helots and give them refuge. But it's in an area that's very sparsely populated, not very many. They actually, again, it comes back to this sense of restraint. The Athenians don't proclaim the freedom of the Helots or anything like this, or say we're fighting to liberate you. They're not really, because perhaps they think, well, that would push the Spartans to an extreme, so we don't want them to keep. But they do have, and again, you look at Demosthenes later on in the 4th century when he's talking about Philip II of Macedonia. He keeps coming up with these plans that are just let's send some ships and some people and see what happens. Yeah. He doesn't ever seem to conceive of any way of actually defeating the enemy. It's all just somehow, if we put effort in, that will somehow be rewarded. So they don't have a clear strategy of how to deal with Sparta. Any more than the Spartans. Once we march up to Athens, we challenge them to battle, and they don't come out. What do we do? They don't really know. Both sides have a strategy for not losing the war, but not for winning it.
Yeah, a lot of the strategies in the Peloponnesian War, I think, seem quite a bit vague. Well, he's going to send some ships, see what happens, kind of thing. Was the next question I want to ask you? I think you kind of hinted at this a little bit already. Was Sparta a bit of a myth? Like, how distorted is the popular image of Sparta today, and how much of it was propaganda at the time? I think in part there's a tendency, actually, in a conflict, sometimes for one side to exaggerate the power of the enemy, because it makes them look better if they defeat them, and it reduces some of the shame if they're defeated by them. But the Spartans are really, really tough. But their history of the outcome, I mean, when we look at the history of the conflict, they don't always win, and sometimes they're reluctant to engage in battle. The
Spartan problem is that there aren't many Spartans, so you can't afford to lose them. So you've got that concern. But yes, you're entirely right. I mean, a classic example, we're in 2026 today. If you read a lot of American books about the Revolutionary War, they will emphasize the British army is the best in the world at that time, which it probably isn't. The Prussians, I suspect, and the Austrians would be arguing about this, and it hasn't done a lot of fighting. But again, it's part of that, compared to creating an army from nothing. It doesn't take anything away from the achievement of Washington and the Continentals and the militia and all that. But it's again that natural instinct, and every country does it. Our enemy is always the best around, because, as you say, if we win, then that means we're really great, and if we lose, well, who could expect us to do any better than that? With the Spartans, they clearly are militarily extremely good, because they do train for war, which nobody else really does in a concerted way.
Are they better at some things than others?
They are, yes, but they're also pretty good at, we emphasize the hoplite battle, the
Yes.
phalanx of people, the serried ranks. They are good at that. But if you look at the stories about Spartan education and training, and if you actually think about the threat they face from Helots, the Helots don't have that sort of phalanx. So fighting in that way, the emphasis is all on stealth. This idea that you keep boys underfed because that means they'll have to steal. And the only crime is not the stealing, but getting caught stealing, because it's supposed to encourage them to move at night, to operate stealthily, to work as a team, all of which are useful militarily, but not really for a hoplite fighting in a phalanx. So aspects of it we sometimes ignore. The Spartans prepare for other things as well. And there are very few hoplite battles in the Peloponnesian War, partly because the Athenians just won't fight the Spartans. They don't want to take the risk. But there's lots of fighting. There's lots of smaller raids, surprise attacks.
Yeah.
And the Spartans are quite good at this.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah. I was thinking about other things. I mean, to what extent, you mentioned earlier that they didn't have a navy at all, basically, originally, and then they had to quickly develop one. What about things like siegecraft? Like, because they're attacking walled cities and things. Like, the Athenians are better at that than the Spartans generally. Is that right? Or
so they have the reputation, and scholars have always wondered where this reputation comes from. They stormed the Persian camp at Plataea after the battle there in 479. And in a few other cases. What the Athenians do is, because their fleet gives them this mobility, and if you, again, look at a map, there's a reason for the frogs around a pond concept. The sea is there. The sea can get you to so many places. It puts a lot of cities, a lot of potential enemies within reach. The Athenians are good at sending an expedition, blockading somebody into submission, cutting them off by land and sea. Nobody's good at direct assault on fortifications. They don't like it, partly because it's costly in lives, and your lives, again, when the Athenians vote to go to war, they are voting to send themselves or their sons or their brothers or their neighbors to war. Your citizens go. There isn't a professional army that does this for you. So you don't want these losses unless you can avoid them. And the long walls connecting Athens to the Piraeus are not that formidable, but the Spartans never even think of trying to attack them. If you can persuade a faction within a city to let you in by the back door, or you can sneak in somehow, then you've got a chance of capturing somewhere. But otherwise, it's basically starving them out. There's a few attempts at Plataea, but that takes best part of several years. Potidaea further north, the same. It takes years to capture these places. So that's something that won't really change in the Greek world. I mean, the Persians can do this. They're really good at that, which is probably why, apart from the few people who hole up on the Acropolis in Athens, nobody tries to withstand a siege. They all just give in when the Persians arrive.
You just reminded me of something that I wanted to ask you about. So I've always just been curious about. So first of all, kind of side note, the Athenian Navy have a trireme, like called the Olympias or something, that they reconstructed trireme, right? That you can go on. And I think it's worth mentioning, in some ways, a trireme is more like a weapon itself than, it's a bit like a torpedo. Like,
it is. It's concentrating all the momentum behind that ram. Yeah. And it's the Athenian fleet, not so much when they fight the Persians, but afterwards, they get so good because they're so maneuverable. Yeah. And the idea is you don't want to ram head to head because that's mutually destructive. So you've got to try and get around behind them and then hit them from the rear and do a glancing blow. Because if you go in at a right angle, your ram's probably going to get stuck in the hull and you can't pull out again. You do board sometimes, and you'll put the equivalent of Marines on deck. Yeah. But mostly this is, as you say, and you've got, if it's fully crewed, 170 rowers to 30 other crew. That's an awful lot of people clammed in into a long but slim ship.
Who can't see anything.
Yes, exactly. And
weirdly. They're going like crazy and they can't see anything that's happening around them, really.
So the fear, the nervousness of one of these battles when you know that suddenly you can get rammed. And of course, the other thing is they're actually effectively the ballast of the ship. Their body weight keeps it stable, because what happens when they abandon ship is that the thing tends to bob up and turn turtle. Even if there's a hole in the side. Wow. So you can sometimes climb onto the wreck of the ship to use that as a raft till you're rescued, hopefully. Wow. But it's so you can't even move much. That's why these fleets have a very limited range. Yeah. Because this is incredibly hard work. You need a lot of fluid to stop yourself dehydrating badly, as well as food, and there's not storage space.
The other thing I wanted to ask you, the thing that puzzled me is the Phoenician ships, the Phoenician warships. What were they like, and how effective were they against triremes, for example?
They're basically the same thing.
Like
Nobody's
similar to
quite sure. Did
triremes?
the Phoenicians invent the trireme? Does it happen in Corinth? Does it happen in Syracuse? Again, there's stories about that's where it's invented. Might be that's the first Greek to build one.
Right.
But I mean, that's the ironic thing. The big Persian fleet defeated at Salamis has hardly any Persians in it at all because Persia's landlocked. You don't have a maritime tradition. You've got all your subject states along the coast, Phoenicians amongst them, the Egyptians, the Ionian Greeks. There are as many, if not more, Greeks fighting in Xerxes' armies and navy than there are fighting against them. It's just over 30 states stay in the alliance to oppose them.
The other question I have about trireme warfare, and particularly the later stages of the Peloponnesian War, is, like I said earlier, there's kind of a bit of a churn rate. Obviously it takes timber to produce all of those ships. And sometimes I'm surprised how quickly they seem to be able to reconstruct them. But my understanding is the Athenians, at certain points, were running low on timber. And so to what extent is that a key resource in determining the outcome of the war?
It's absolutely vital, and it's one big reason why the Athenians are always obsessed with the north, with the coast of Macedonia, that area where you've got, because there's not a lot of forest in Attica by this time. And it's particularly for ships, but also for building the big monuments. You need roof timbers, you need stuff for scaffolding, and you don't have it locally. You can't source this. So you're getting it's the same way they're developing, they're eating food and cereal grown in the Crimea and southern Ukraine, and they building their ships out of stuff they've got from Macedonia or from the north, that area.
Well, that leads on to, so another key point that you kind of touched on a little bit before. Here's another what-if question for you. If the Athenians had conquered Sicily, and if they went on to defeat Sparta, would they have invaded Persia? This is something a kind of rumor that's mentioned sometimes, I think, that Alcibiades had this plan. The
thing is, you get it more as the 4th century goes on and the various Pan-Hellenists start talking about, we've got to join together to defeat the Persians, which of course Alexander will eventually do, or Philip will start, Alexander will do. It's quite hard to tell because we don't actually know when the war between the Greeks led by the Athenians and the Persians ends. There seems to be a treaty. They seem to stop fighting each other around about the middle of the 5th century, but it's not clear. Thucydides doesn't mention anything specifically. And what they've seemed to have done, the agreement as presented in some sources, is the Persians will stay 3 days' journey away from the coast. So the key thing, first of all, is liberate the Ionian Greeks, your sort of kindred, your culturally similar people, the Hellenes living under Persian rule. But also, if they've got bases on the coast, then all of central Greece and Athens is just not far away. And it's just a few days. It's within easy reach. So it's trying to push them. If they don't have bases, they can't get to you. And they're not it's even harder for them to come over land again. So it's, we know that after 480 or 479, when Xerxes' army is finally defeated, we know the Persians aren't going to try another invasion of Greece. But people at the time didn't know that. And the Persian Empire, whilst embarrassed by this, it is not seriously damaged. Xerxes, yes, his credibility suffers, but he rules for another decade or so before he falls to a palace conspiracy. So the Persian Empire is still vast. And it's almost as if, another of the great ironies is that in the aftermath in the 4th century BC, when the Spartans have become resented, their brief period of dominance ends, you have what's called the King's Peace, where the Greek states agree to keep the peace, and this will be enforced by the Persian great king, who doesn't bother to do it. But this whole idea, again, going back to our golden moment, our greatest achievement was defeating this evil empire that attacked us, and then suddenly we're allowing it to interfere. From a Persian point of view, they keep the Greeks busy afterwards without having to send expeditions, and they're no threat to them until and they're a nuisance. Spartan army will turn up in the early 4th century, maraud around Asia Minor, capture some cities, plunder some things, but it doesn't do much. That's probably what the Persians expected Philip II and Alexander the Great to do. And it's a heck of a shock when you've suddenly got this very aggressive leader with an exceptionally good army that's steaming right across your empire.
So where did it all go wrong for the Athenians? What was the Sicilian disaster? Like, to be blunt about it, what caused it? What caused the Sicilian disaster? It started off well, kind of, or like it started off impressive.
It grows. I mean, some cities in Sicily that are in conflict with other cities that are allied to Syracuse, the biggest city, which is by this time, ironically enough, a democracy, so should have more in common with the Athenians. They ask for help and they promise the Athenians that they'll fund the war. And they show off. It's again this story of a trick they play where they concentrate all the wealth of the city in one person's house to sort of show, oh yeah, we're all like this. This is what we've all got. Yeah. The Athenians get, and again, it's hard to understand. This is during a lull. They're not fighting the Spartans at the time. So they get distracted and they suddenly think, wow, this sounds exciting. It's really wealthy. We'll have glory. We can do it. So the whole thing escalates as they commit more and more troops. They then have, one of the leading advocates is Alcibiades. But then after they've sent him as one of their 3 commanders, he gets recalled because of a involvement with a scandal. You've had this story that he's sort of presented a mock parody of the Eleusinian mysteries, this very sacred rite in his house. And then somebody has gone and smashed up the Hermes, these sort of statues of Hermes around the city. Even though he's not implicated in that, it's sort of this general, again, you can have this in the modern sense where aspects of sleaze start to spread as a story gathers momentum, and people who aren't directly involved in it or implicated in any way suddenly somehow, because they didn't do anything or because we just don't like them for other reasons, get caught up.
All right, here's another real deep dive what-if scenario. What if they'd followed Alcibiades' policy? He wanted to send a smaller force, which would have arrived more quickly, I'm guessing, and might have gained entry to some of the cities that the Athenians were denied later under Nicaeus.
I mean, maybe they would have got more allies and got more of a base. But again, it's with the what ifs. It's like, what if Hannibal marched on Rome after the Battle of Cannae? Probably it would be the same, but we don't quite know. Would people have just been that enough to tip them over the edge? Would the Syracusans, who are supposedly on the verge of giving in, if the Athenians had rushed there in the first year and stayed there, would they have quit? Maybe, maybe not. So it's hard to say.
One of the other things that seems key to the disaster in Sicily is the Athenians didn't take any horses with them, but they were subjected to harassment from cavalry attacks. So I think they believed that they were going to get horses there, but didn't. That seems like a major mistake on their part.
It is. I mean, it's difficult to transport horses over that sort of distance.
Yeah.
And the Athenian fleet, they've used small numbers, but they're using, a couple of hundred or something in some of the expeditions. They're not using the numbers. So they send a pitiful few and expect, as you say, to find the horses locally. But it's partly a cost thing and a practicality. I mean, when later the Duke of Wellington, when he first goes to Portugal in 1808, the British government sends a regiment of cavalry, but they only send one squadron with horses and say the rest will get there. In spite of the fact this is a country not known for its horses, it's just been occupied by the French. That's why you're sending the army. So any sort of military resource like that is likely to have been gathered up. So people have these wonderful ideas that obviously sounded good on paper. There aren't going to work. It is a problem, and they do take time to adapt. So it makes it harder, but you do feel Nicaeus is absolutely the wrong man to be in charge of this expedition that he doesn't believe in anyway. Yeah. And then he does the same thing. He tries the same thing he had before the war when he writes back these really depressing letters, emphasizing how bad things are, but he doesn't actually want to say, I'd like to be recalled, and I think we should end this,
quit.
Because he doesn't want to get the blame for it. So he's again thinking of his own status and saying, well, it's also, he's trying to sort of get them to make the decision for him.
Could he have been executed?
Well, you never know with the Athenians. That's the problem.
Maybe that's why he was worried about.
Probably, and certainly humiliated. And status is such a big thing.
Yeah,
and it's vital for your. But he's clearly a sick man. But he also, I think, he just has that personality where he doesn't want to stand up and take the responsibility, which really is what you need at a general. Good or bad, they better do something. Whereas dithering, which later on he'll dither with the retreat because of a bad omen, And this is the thing, Athens, one of the most rational cities around. They ought to realize about an eclipse that this isn't something you need to worry about too much.
Yeah.
But they wait, they make basically a month, and then it's much harder to get away. It's a bit like Lord Raglan in the Crimean War. It's somebody who, in a position, makes always the worst decision possible. Is a nice chap. He gets this terrific write-up with Thucydides as well-meaning and decent, but he's just the wrong man in that job.
There's a story about Pericles. His navy saw an eclipse, and he stopped and explained to them the theories of Anaxagoras, and how it was a natural phenomenon, so that they wouldn't treat it as a superstitious omen. And that contrasts with the story. Nicias does the opposite.
Yeah.
And at least a catastrophe. Here's my kind of hot take on that a little bit. So the Spartans turned the tide of the war to some extent by training the Syracusans. Didn't they? The Spartans sent a small force.
Well, it's just one man initially. It's one officer.
And he trained the Syracusans, and organized them, right? Rather than committing lots of Spartan troops. But in some ways, isn't that closer to what Alcibiades wanted the Athenians to do, to send a small force, recruit allies, and train them?
It's much lower risk, and I think Alcibiades, he probably would have acquired for the Athenians some allies in Sicily and maybe in Italy as well. Not a spectacular result as some of the others, they're trying to do. And it's partly that fuzzy, because they don't, everybody seems to know we're going to attack Syracuse, but that's not what the assembly has voted and sent the expedition to do. It's go there and then the generals would decide. Right. So it sort of gathers momentum. There's that lack of clarity. But yes, that limit your commitment. He's talking about a fleet of 60 ships instead of 120, and then it ends up nearly 200 by then when they've reinforced it. It's a sledgehammer for no reason.
Okay, here's a different sort of question for you. What should be made into a movie? I always think this is a good question for historians. When you're studying history, you think, there's this really cool thing here, and no one knows about it. And I mention this because, I interviewed Armand Danger recently, who'd written a book about Socrates, and he, on social media or in the book or something, he'd said there needs to be a movie about Alcibiades. It's kind of crying out for it. He was like a rock star in ancient Greece. You could totally see a Hollywood celebrity like Brad Pitt or somebody playing him today, maybe.
Well, I think it's an HBO series. There's so much material.
There's too much content.
Get involved with this scandal, so he flees from the fleet in Syracuse. Says, "I'll travel back on my own ship," and then slips sort of away from the escort. Goes to Sparta, tells the Spartans, this is how you beat the Athenians, but then has an affair with one of the king's wives. But they have two kings, the wife of one of the kings. And, you have all this thing about a man later on being debarred from the throne because they assume, or they claim, that he's Alcibiades' son rather than his supposed father. And so, you've gone there, you've been sheltered by these people. You've apparently, according to Plutarch, you've gone Spartan. You've let your hair grow long. You've ate the simple food. But you've shown off by just how quickly you adapt. It's this very aristocratic thing. And then you basically treat them that well. So he has to flee from there. And the way he goes, chummies up with the Persians, goes back to the Athenians, that the man eventually gets killed by Plutarch's interpretation is that by a group of angry brothers, because he's basically abused their sister and they burn his house down at night. So yes, it's all there. And, this man who is supposed to be the best looking man of his generation, even the sheer arrogance, it's a very chilling story where his wife wants to divorce him. And goes to court over this, and he just walks into the court and says, sort of, come home, and leaves her off. And all the Athenians say, oh, isn't this wonderful? This is how a real man should behave. And you think, well,
it's kind of spectacular. And being friends with Socrates. And there's too much for
That's
a movie.
the thing, where you've got the, twice being involved in very heavy fighting and escaping. Because you stick with Socrates and him sheltering. So it's all there. His is a great story, but Pericles is interesting, but Alcibiades is definitely your sort of anti-hero type because he's clearly not.
He's a colourful. Well, I'm going to defend Alcibiades.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. So towards the end of the war, when the Athenians thought it would be a good idea to maybe have a civil war inside the middle of the Peloponnesian War after having failed to invade Sicily, there's a lot of bad decisions made in the Peloponnesian War by the Athenians. So they're kind of on the verge of having a civil war. Alcibiades returns and helps to reunite the Democrats and the oligarchs, and then leads them, or helps lead them, to a series of victories in the north of Greece, if I remember rightly.
It takes him a long time before he goes back to Athens, because he's joined the fleet, which is rejecting the revolution that's occurred back home. And he's sort of arguing for this, not quite the pure democracy, but something a bit more restricted, because he wants to be... Because you have this paradox that when he eventually returns home, you have the story that he's not sure whether he's going to be exequted, because he's effectively under suspended death sentence from his earlier crime and running away from the trial and the investigation. So, I mean, he does the right thing for his country then. And you feel he tries. He is a little bit lacking in focus. You know, one of the big naval disasters that starts to give the Spartans some confidence is when Alcibiades goes off on a diplomatic mission and appoints one of his household to command the fleet, who doesn't seem to have the skill. He gets lured into a very obvious trap. And it's not a major disaster, but it's embarrassing when you've got so used to winning all the time. It starts to discourage you and encourage the Spartans.
They remove they strip him of his status as a general after that. But prior to that, he was doing quite well. He turned the war around briefly. And I would argue that even we could see some influence of Socrates, and he gave a conciliatory speech where he said he didn't hold any grudges against his political opponents. I think we could maybe even see the influence of Socrates in that, in a sense.
I think so. I think the friendship was genuine, I suspect. And the thing is, Alcibiades is clearly very bright.
Yeah.
You know, so that this is someone, and even when he does some of these odd things, you can understand, you have the comment where, again, might be invented, but when he refuses to go back to Athens to stand trial, and, somebody asked him, well, won't you let the people decide? And he said, I wouldn't even let my mother decide on my life. This is too important. I don't trust.
I'm going to defend Alcibiades a little bit in both of these cases where he was stripped of his status as general, and then when they were going to recall him to put him on trial, who would the jury have been composed of if arguably most of Alcibiades' supporters in the military were now on deployment?
That's clearly the calculation, is that why? Because you think, if you really got a suspicion, you try this man, you don't send him off as one of your three commanders and then summon him back.
But
unless you're thinking very much in personal enmities rather than what's best for the city. You either deal with it before he goes and then say, okay, you can't because of this, but you don't. But yes, I'm sure you're right. There's an element of thinking we've got a lot of influential people out of the way. People who will speak up for him, people who are sympathetic, are off on campaign and can't come back.
And then the argument is again, as soon as he leaves, he's deployed in the Navy, the Athenians turn against him because all of his supporters are out of the city.
Something similar may happen with Cimon earlier when he goes to help the Spartans. You then have some revolutionary changes in the law, because basically all the people who think his way, all the more conservatives, have gone off and they're not there to vote. And it's big again, because of the immediacy, it all depends on who turns up on the day and who actually votes. And then it's instantly, that's law. That's our decision.
I think that's part of the dynamic of Athenian politics is, if you leave the city to engage in a military campaign, then who's running the city? In your absence, possibly a lot of your enemies. And also there's another legend. Alcibiades ended up in Thrace at one point and went native there as well, turned up wearing furs like a barbarian. And the Athenian navy was destroyed by the Spartans. There's a story that he turned up at their camp and warned them that they'd moored the ships in a vulnerable location, but the commanders scoffed at him and wouldn't recognize his status or
think
take his
it's
advice.
a mixture of that, and it's this nervousness because the previous big victory, the Athenians, because in the aftermath the admirals don't manage to save a lot of men who are in the water. Some ships get sunk early on, and as I say, the ships then float up. There's a storm brews up before they're able to go back and rescue them, and then the Athenian people vote to execute all the 10 successful commanders. A couple of them, one of them who is executed is Pericles' own son, his only surviving illegitimate son. So once you've had that example, it's bound to make your admirals incredibly cautious about doing anything even slightly controversial, and accepting advice from the recently discredited Alcibiades probably fits into that. So even though he's right, I mean, it may just be that they were too stubborn to admit, or that they didn't have any other idea of where to go. The fleet is in a bad position because that last battle is utterly one-sided. They are, the Spartans mopped the floor with them. So, and he's right. This is clear, and you do feel, yes, Alcibiades certainly wanted to be amongst the great men, if not the greatest men in Athens, but he is deep down a patriot. He wants Athens to do well. As a reflect, so I think he is sincere. I can believe. To me, that story makes sense, that he would turn up and say, "Look, you're doing something really stupid. Change it before it's too late." But I can also understand in the context how cautious anybody would be. It's also, by this time, a lot of the people who knew him probably aren't around, or certainly not with the fleet in a senior role.
So I've got one final question. So this is quite a specific thing as well. In Plato's Apology, Socrates brings up his military service, like kind of in an offhand way. But I don't think it's such an offhand thing. I think it may have been quite a significant thing for him to emphasize during the trial. Socrates was about 71 when he was executed. I think the great puzzle about it is why they didn't execute him sooner, in some regards, right? And I wonder if one reason for that, I wonder, I'm interested in the Athenians' tolerance of Socrates, because he was a very controversial figure. And I wonder if that could be attributed in some regards to his status as a hoplite, veteran of several major battles. And also there's this incident where he saves Alcibiades' life.
Yeah.
But would have been a decorated military hero in an Athenian sense if he hadn't turned down the award and it was given to Alcibiades instead. And there's also a passage where it's kind of implied in some of the sources. You mentioned, I think, this incident with lackeys, if I remember rightly, where at the Battle of Delium, where Socrates seems to be accompanying him and protecting him, I think after he'd been unhorsed. So maybe not saving his life, but maybe saving his life, or at least protecting him, and he's during a vulnerable retreat. So I think there may have been a perception of Socrates as quite an accomplished military hero. And I'd like to speculate that might be one of the reasons why the Athenians tolerated him as long as they did.
I think so, because it makes him a good citizen. And we
that's
have to remember, when you think of Aeschylus, the poet, his epitaph that he's supposed to have composed for himself was all about his heroism at Marathon.
Yeah.
The fact that I've written all these great plays, don't mention that. But remember, his brother is mortally wounded at Marathon. So, they are there getting their hands dirty. And it comes back to this: when the citizens vote for war, the citizens go and fight that war. And they risk their lives, and in some cases lose them. At Delium, Socrates is supposed to have rallied a group around him that retreat in order and willing to fight. So the Thebans, instead of chasing them, they go and chase easy and meet the people who've thrown their weapons down and are running away. So, again, it's a pattern you get in a lot of battles in history, that if you're still willing... But he's saving the lives of other citizens. It's not just the heroism. This is a big deal because those people have families, but it's also just the principle. Yeah. So I think... the reason they probably turn against him is because things have gone so bad that everyone is getting desperate and everybody is starting to look. So all sorts of things that you can tolerate because, yes, he's annoying. Yes, he's, he goes around saying all these things, teaching people these ideas, but he's a good citizen and Athens is doing well. When Athens is not doing so well, then it's maybe, he wasn't a good enough citizen, was he? So maybe that outweighs the sort of the merits. But again, Sophocles, again, who doesn't come across very military at all, commands a fleet on several occasions. We sometimes forget because we concentrate on the intellectual, the cultural side of these things, but they are very active. You have to be an Athenian. You are expected to go and do this, and your neighbors will know, and they will judge you. So if you're like Socrates and you are, as determined fighting as you are debating or thinking, he really has proved himself. So I think that counts for even more than, say, if you're a decorated military veteran, now there's some respect. But this is the whole community of veterans. It counts even more because you know what it means.
Now, there's a couple of other odd things in this regard. So Xenophon, in his Memorabilia, there's a whole bunch of those dialogues where he shows Socrates discussing military tactics, strategy, training techniques. Now, some of the scholars that translate that work or comment on it say, well, that's just because Xenophon's a general and he's putting all of his own ideas into Socrates' mouth. But I think that's a little bit hasty. They might be right, but it could be like that Socrates actually knew a lot about military strategy, training, and tactics. The Athenians sometimes attended lectures, courses on these subjects. He was a highly educated man. It's quite possible that he'd studied these subjects. But even Plato portrays Socrates discussing military training with Nicias and Laches. And he's besties with a bunch of different generals, including Alcibiades, Nicias, Laches. So I kind of wonder whether, obviously Socrates wasn't an officer, wasn't a general, but were some regular hoplites potentially like experienced veterans who had studied military tactics? Is there such a thing in the ranks of Athenian hoplites as an infantryman that resembles a Roman centurion, for example, like maybe has a bit more experience or status?
I think in terms of formal status, it's very hard to say. We don't really know how the tribal regiments, created these 10 tribes under Cleisthenes and then how they operate. But if you think at what the Athenians were capable of doing, they could vote and decide and say, suddenly, right, we're going to send 50 ships to the Black Sea and the Crimea, and we're going to land there, and we're going to take this city, this town, or we're going to send them to Corcyra to intervene, or we're going to Egypt and intervene. The organization to make this fleet of triremes is pretty impressive, but then to supply them, organize them, send them, right, who's doing this? We don't really know the mechanisms. How did you get called up? Was your number called? The tribe has to provide so many sailors, so many soldiers. So there's lots of people. They're actually doing this, and they are doing it exceptionally well, very efficiently. So there's lots of people who have a very strong practical sense. How do I organize? How do I supply? What's the best way to train to do this? Because you can't just pick this up. So I think there's an awful lot of knowledge, and Socrates is part of the class who is doing this, but talking about it.
Yeah.
And whether you have a mind where you're asking questions, almost anything you do, you will be starting to think about, well, how does this work? But there is this collective experience and knowledge. And it's reflected. These people cannot just be commanded. You've elected the strategos who is commanding your regiment and overall, and he has to treat you as fellow citizens. He can't just command you. He can't punish you in brutal ways. And even, you see it with Xenophon to some extent reflected in the Anabasis and this thing, whether, the 10,000 at Conaxa, they're starting to advance more quickly and somebody calls out not to run races and they stop. This idea that even in that mercenary army, you have the old hands, the sensible voices. Thucydides tells a similar story about one of the Spartan kings being persuaded not to do something when an old soldier calls out. So I think we sometimes think of them as professional armies, but they're not. They're sort of militia in a sense, but they are very organized. They are very good because they're doing this so often.
And there must be like a little bit more of a hierarchy than it seems to us, and maybe a little bit more specialism, just naturally people following, more experienced soldiers maybe falling into certain roles. Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me. It's been a real pleasure. Another great discussion. We hope you listeners enjoyed the conversation as much as we did. Please share the link with your friends and subscribe to the Stoicism Philosophy as a Way of Life newsletter and Substack for more podcasts and articles on philosophy and psychology. Thanks for listening. It's goodbye from me, Donald Robertson, and from my guest, Adrian Goldsworthy.
Thanks for having me.
Bye, everyone.